Bites. My name is Julia Ashworth, and I will be serving as the moderator for our January discussion. This month, we're featuring Dr. Emily Norweg, who will be leading this discussion on the rights of the incarcerated. Dr. Norweg holds her PhD from Georgetown University, where she completed a dissertation on the history of higher education in prison as a National Academy of Education and Spencer Foundation Dissertation Fellowship recipient. Outside of her own research, Norweg has contributed to projects for Ithaca SNR, the Smithsonian Institution of Archives, and several historians, including Marcia Chatelain, and her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Franchise: The Golden Arches in Black America. In her experience as an educator, Norweg has had the privilege of teaching and learning with both traditional and incarcerated college students. Thank you so very much for joining us today, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started here. Everything looking good?
Looks great.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really thrilled to have this special opportunity to jump back in to my own research and discuss this topic, which is the rights of the incarcerated. I do have two very quick disclaimers before we get going, which is today I'm presenting on my own personal research. It's completely independent from my employment, does not represent the opinion or policy of my employer. The other disclaimer is a little bit more fun, which is that I have two very mischievous Scottish Terriers who are surrounding me right now, and I apologize in advance if they interrupt with barking.
It's totally fine.
I'll hop right in and begin by highlighting two essential elements of George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights that had a crucial bearing on conceptions of rights of the incarcerated in the United States generally. And I have a photo here from your very own Gunston Hall of a draft copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. I'd like to highlight for you sections 8 and 9 of the Declaration. The first of these, section 8, specified rights of the accused, including the right to a speedy trial by jury. And the second of these, section 9, articulated limitations on punishment, which included a provision against cruel and unusual punishments. And both of these sections have become touchstones for foundational national documents. When Congress passed the Bill of Rights in 1789, eventually ratifying 10 of these in December 1791, that language closely echoed that of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And Article 8, just as the Virginia Declaration's Article 8, also outlines the rights of the accused. Article 10, again, ensures against cruel and unusual punishment. So a glaring and persistent issue that comes out of this, of course, is what exactly constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. And it's something that has been an issue and something that's been debated since the passage of the Bill of Rights, and also likely since the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And while it's its own crucially important, fascinating, deeply riveting topic, that is not within my realm of expertise. My personal research centers on a very specific aspect of the rights of the incarcerated, and that is education. I arrived at the research for my first project following a pivotal experience teaching at the DC jail, which I did in my capacity as a volunteer for the Georgetown Prison Scholars Program. And it was in the context of getting to know my students there that I started to really think about how we had arrived at that moment of college instruction behind bars. And I really wanted to know what that history was. How did higher education in prison come to be in the United States? And how was it woven into the fabric of incarceration in this country, and why? Turns out that the history of education in prison in the United States is actually nearly as old as the nation itself. And I could really give a very in-depth overview of this, but I'll instead just kind of look at some major touchstones in this history to kind of ground our conversation. And in the early 19th century in particular, there were well-documented efforts by both religious and benevolent societies to offer tutoring to individuals who were incarcerated. And as the United States progressed into the progressive era, the advent of correspondence courses, which allowed individuals to engage in remote coursework well before the Zoom age, were implemented across the country, really from the span of the late 1800s into the early 1900s. So if we dive into historic newspapers, we see evidence of, for example, courses that were offered at Kansas's Leavenworth prison, where incarcerated individuals were taking courses on agriculture and civil engineering and other courses that would help to prepare them for life upon release. And again, another example would be in California in 1914, a group of professors from the University of California began offering courses at Folsom and San Quentin prisons, and that eventually blossomed into a bona fide college and prison program. And then across the country, there was an individual, oops, sorry, named Austin McCormick, who became the assistant director of what was then the brand new Federal Bureau of Prisons in 1930. And he really undertook the study and work of improving prison education in the United States. He would found what was eventually known as the Correctional Education Association, and in 1931, he published a groundbreaking book called The Education of Adult Prisoners. And all of these people were really guided by the principle of rehabilitation, which is now an outmoded term for what exactly the purpose of programming like education is in the prison context. But it was important for understanding what motivated these people in trying to create educational opportunities in prison spaces. And as we move into the 20th century, there is a pivotal moment in the way that education is conceptualized more nationally speaking. And that is with President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, which included the Higher Education Act of 1965. And here we really see the federal government coming in and offering educational opportunities in a way that was really unprecedented to that point. In alignment with that, as education opportunities are expanding across the country, there is also a movement within prisons by incarcerated people themselves to try to advocate for gaining more rights in prison, among them educational opportunities. And while there are many examples of this in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, perhaps the most well-known was the Attica Prison Uprising in New York in 1971. And then in 1973, the inception of Basic Educational Opportunity Grants, which later became known as Pell Grants for Senator Claiborne Pell in 1980, began offering federal need-based financial aid for college students. Among those who were recipients of this federal financial aid were incarcerated college students. Throughout the 70s and 80s, there is a persistent war on crime and war on drugs that is deeply influencing the fabric and context of incarceration in the United States and contributing to the reasons why people come in contact with what is known as the criminal justice system. And I'll talk a little bit more about mass incarceration later, but this sort of provides a general overview of what's in the mix when we're talking about prison education and specifically the history of higher education in prison itself. Hopefully that overview gave you the context needed to discover why it was that I quickly realized that when I was working on my project, a history on higher education in prison writ large nationally would have necessitated a multi-volume series of tomes on the subject, because each state has its own unique history grounded in its approach to education, its approach to criminal law, the prison system, etc. So I chose to focus on Massachusetts, which is my home state. And there were two reasons in particular why I chose Massachusetts. The first is that it is home to the longest continuously running college and prison program in the country. That's the Boston University Prison Education Program. And the second reason is something that Massachusetts has in common with Virginia, which is that both of these commonwealths lay claim to a sense of exceptionalism that is rooted partially in a tradition of the American Revolution and also in a long history of enumerating specific individual rights. And the history of higher education in prison in Massachusetts is just as complicated as the national history, and it's also just as long. So today I'll provide a very brief snapshot into what I would like to sort of frame as the boom and bust days of college and prison in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I put a picture up here of Elizabeth Barker. She was the founder of the Boston University Prison Education Program, and it was with the permission of Boston University's infamously fiery personality, its president, John Silber, that she started offering college coursework behind bars in 1972. Now, a crucial element of the Boston University Prison Education Program is that it relied partially on funding from the university itself. And once Pell Grants entered the equation in the 1970s, that offered liberal arts colleges and community colleges the opportunity to be able to offer coursework behind bars as well, because they didn't have to rely on their individual universities' funding. But Boston University was able to kind of mix the two, and that had a lot to do with its staying power over the course of time. I've put up here some of the major issues that were facing college and prison programs, including the Boston University program in the latter part of the 20th century. And the first of these is something that is actually quite relevant still to this day, which is the issue of what we call stranded credits. So in the early days of college and prison programming and continuing today, there is an issue about what happens when the very common practice of transferring incarcerated individuals from one prison to another impacts their education. And often these programs do not work in concert with each other. So if somebody had begun a college education at one prison and then 3 years later they were transferred to another, they might have to start from scratch because their credits didn't transfer because they're coming from two different college and prison programs. And so that was something that from the earliest days in 70s and 80s was an issue in trying to coordinate among programs, each with different interests and different funding schemes and different direction. And to this day, it's something Massachusetts has actually done a lot to remedy this problem, but it's something that still impacts many college and prison programs across the country today. And then another very crucial thing that was affecting college and prison programs was the optics of it. And I'm sure you can think of some very pointed criticisms that people would direct toward college and prison programs, but it really came to a head in 1987. The furlough program in particular became a issue of national interest in the context of the 1988 presidential campaign. At the time, it was Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis who was running against George Bush. And in 1987, a incarcerated individual named Willie Horton, who was incarcerated in Massachusetts, was on a furlough from his prison and was arrested in Maryland for multiple violent crimes. And that incident became a touchstone of the Bush campaign, which in turn associated Massachusetts and its prison policy, especially the furlough policy, as being somehow the derivative of crime and the proliferation of crime in the United States. And it was with that rhetoric and that national attention that over the years that kind of just snowballed. And by 1994, there was a really huge piece of anti-crime legislation that came before Congress and was passed. We know it now as the 1994 crime bill. It had a much longer name, but part of the 1994 crime bill was that it rendered incarcerated individuals ineligible for federal Pell Grant funding. And that impact was devastating on college and prison throughout the country and also in Massachusetts. It's really difficult to provide exact statistics on exactly how devastating it was. And in fact, one of the major challenges in the higher education and prison research space is that there's been historically very uneven documentation in when programs were founded, how many existed at any given time, et cetera, et cetera. However, there was one study that found that in 1982, there were around 350 participating colleges and universities who were offering some form of college and prison education. And by 1997, just a few years after the crime bill was passed and incarcerated individuals could no longer receive Pell Grant funding, there were only 8 total programs left in the country. One of those, of course, was Boston University's. And I put at the bottom here a quote that Elizabeth Barker often liked to employ. She would say it to her students. She said it in an article that she had published, but she used to say that a liberal arts education was an education befitting a free man. And I think that's a consideration that is especially appropriate and poignant for our discussion today. I put 2 images here on the screen that I like to use. Both of these are from the Prison Policy Initiative website. And on your left, you see incarceration rates comparing the United States and specifically Virginia with other NATO founding countries. And the reason that I put this on here, by the way, if you're interested in looking at the other states, they have state-specific graphs for each state, and you can find it on their website. But the reason that I put this on here is that as of 2025, even though this graph is from 2024, the US still incarcerates more people per capita than any other democracy in the world. And as part of that conversation, it's really important to look at the other graph, which depicts racial and ethnic disparities in correctional facilities, and recognize that the racial and ethnic disparities that exist within the prison system are a direct reflection of the impact of laws and practices that have existed for centuries now. So while there's a big discrepancy between rates of incarceration in the US and other founding NATO countries, there is also a very stark contrast between the racial and ethnic makeup of the United States generally and that of the prison population within the United States. There are myriad complex reasons behind this. It has its roots in laws and surveillance methods, most of them employed in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery. It also has to do with a lot of these professed wars on crime that really defined the latter part of the 20th century, and expanding policing and punishment with an emphasis on targeting non-white populations. And that has generated what is sort of a feedback loop where the communities that are most affected by these systemic inequities also become the most heavily targeted and surveilled, which initiates this continuous cycle of deprivation of access to basic rights, among them education, which could potentially, in some small way, disrupt that process of this feedback loop. I said I'd return to mass incarceration, and I'd like to end here with this image because I think it does a really good job of visually illustrating just how profound the idea of mass incarceration in the United States is. And if you take a look at this chart here, which comes from the Sentencing Project's website, you'll notice that toward the end of the 20th century is when the incarceration rates in the United States really spike. And while they are coming down, they are still very, very high. So I think that when we're thinking about rights of incarcerated individuals, we always need to have the context of mass incarceration in mind. And that ignites new debates surrounding the rights of the accused and the incarcerated, particularly in the context of deeply rooted societal inequities. So thank you very much for your time on that happy note, and I look forward to your questions.
I was muted. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Emily. That was really, truly both a fascinating discussion and really an important discussion. I have a couple of quick questions for you. So, um, when you were um, mentioning the stranded credit challenge that's still an issue today, has this been mitigated in any way due to the ability to access online or virtual learning? Um, or since you did say that the number of colleges in this program has diminished over the years, is that just not the case?
So this is an excellent question. And I will say that in 2020, the um, access to federal Pell Grants was restored for incarcerated individuals. And so
Okay.
since then, there has been a big increase in the number of college and prison opportunities available, which is great to see. And I would say even before that happened in the 2010s, there was kind of a new renaissance of college and prison programs across the country. So both public and private funding have somewhat mitigated the disastrous effects of the 1994 crime bill, which is great. With online virtual learning, there are some really great examples of this working very well in prisons across the country. And I think New York in particular, and even Maine, I want to say, have used tablets and
Hmm.
other forms of technology in their classrooms. However, as you might imagine, one of the huge issues that prisons face is just getting technology into prisons. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and not only even just one or two computers, but the debate about whether or not prisons should have tablets accessible to people, that is like a whole other topic. And so I think I think there's a long way to go in terms of implementing technology in prisons that could really help with college and prison programming, but um, it certainly presents a really great opportunity.
Oh, 100%. Yes.
Yeah.
And then I had a question about how really you got interested in all of this. I mean, this was truly such an interesting discussion. What inspired you to want to learn more?
So I interestingly enough, when I went to the DC jail to teach a college course, I was teaching on what was then going to be my dissertation subject, which was the history of school busing. And it was like the first week that I was there and I got to know my students, I just found myself in the classroom saying, how did we get here? What is this moment of higher education in prison, and what does this mean? And what
Yeah,
is its history? And I thought that I would be able to find the answer pretty easily, and it was actually so much more complicated. Um, I'm so sorry. It was so much more complicated than that, and I was fascinated by it. I think in a perfect world, I would love to be able to look at a more national approach to the history of higher education in prison, but I get so bogged down by the intricacies of each individual state and how many
absolutely.
different things go together to create this history that I think much more historical research needs to be done.
Total sense. Yes. But why Massachusetts?
So Massachusetts, as I mentioned, is my home state, so I'm a little bit biased in terms of, I guess, knowledge of the Commonwealth, and also, I was really interested in the idea of Massachusetts exceptionalism and this idea that
For sure.
Massachusetts, like Virginia, has always been considered this beacon of education and reform and progressivism. But of course, there are really concrete examples throughout history of that not being true. And for
Absolutely.
me, the treatment of incarcerated people was another example of a foray into kind of deconstructing that idea of Massachusetts exceptionalism. And I was also really intrigued by the Boston University prison education program and
Oh, for sure.
wanted to know how it had the staying power that it did and how it was able to survive. And in my dissertation, I relied a lot on oral histories, and I got to speak with a lot of the people who were responsible for the early days of that program. And it was amazing to be able to hear from them firsthand and
Absolutely.
learn how it came to be.
That sounds amazing. Could you tell me a little bit more about some of these? I was going to ask about your methods for this research. Can you talk to me a little bit more about, why you chose to do oral histories and maybe something that stood out to you about what these people were telling you?
Sure. So I will say that doing the research for this project was challenging, not only because it took place just as COVID hit,
Yes.
also because there were no records of college and prison programming
Mm,
in Massachusetts, even though I knew that it existed. There was the STEP program in the 1960s. There was the Curry College program in the 1980s, the Boston University Prison Education Program, Northeastern. I could go on and on and on. But every time that I contacted the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, I was told that there were no records. And then
mm.
once they sent me, I think, a copy of a news article from the Boston Globe, and they were like, here are our records. So I
Oh
had to rely
man.
on a different blend of sources. I ended up using several university archives. I used the Massachusetts State Archives to look at governor's records. And then I decided that there was no way to fill the archival silences of the incarcerated individuals who were participants in this program other than to engage in oral histories. And
Absolutely.
so that was just amazing to be able to speak to people who had gone through these programs and had firsthand experience, and they knew the history of the foundation of these programs better than anyone, and it was great to be able to speak with them.
Well, I can imagine. So in terms of these people that you were speaking to, were they able to um, provide you with anything that just really stuck out to you? Was there anything that you heard from them that maybe surprised you or was unexpected, or maybe it's even something that you expected them to say but just really stuck with you?
I think there are too many examples to share, quite honestly. I was profoundly moved by everyone I spoke with, and I just think that the overarching theme of every conversation I had was, regardless of whether or not an individual ended up graduating from a program, the
Yeah,
experience of being in a college course in the context of a prison environment was transformative and freeing. And that is something that is impossible to measure, and I think that's one of the big challenges that higher education and prison faces in terms of looking at scholarly research, is that we can look at metrics like recidivism, which really does not have any kind of shared definition, but there's this sort of intangible aspect of transformation, freedom, liberation that really um, inspires individuals, and yeah, that's the most
yeah,
important thing.
absolutely. Well, thank you so very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come speak with us. And thank you so much to our audience for tuning in today. Now, please do join us next month for a continuation of this mini series on the rights of the incarcerated. We're going to have Katie Crooks from the Workhouse Art Center leading this discussion on Wednesday, February 18th at 12:30. We hope to see you then. And as always, stay hungry.